Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do a long overdue recommendations video, and that is of vampire books. I have said so many times on my channel that vampire fiction is not my favorite, but I was able to compile a list of vampire books that do work for me, and hopefully you'll find something among this list, whether you are a vampire lover or are someone like myself who just doesn't always love this subgenre. Now, I do want to clarify, because when I say to people I don't like vampire books, they typically assume that I mean I don't like books like Twilight, and so they go on to recommend me horror books involving vampires. And I'll be honest, I've read or attempted to read several of the vampire classics of horror, and for the most part a lot of them just miss the mark. I just don't like them that much as creatures, but as always there are exceptions to the rule, and that's why I have this video here. So again, hopefully you find some recommendations. All that being said, let's get started. First, I do want to talk about Dracula by Bram Stoker, and this is a classic that actually did work fairly well for me. I read this for the first time years ago. Of course, it's the classic story of Dracula and the people who go out to hunt him down. And I've said many times on my channel that in general, horror classics are not my go-to books. I do prefer more modern horror that's been written in, say, the last 20, 30 years. But Dracula actually held up quite well for me. I found it quite easy to read, easy to follow, and at times I found it quite scary. I think everyone knows the general premise, but I do remember some really creepy scenes when they are going and lifting up coffins and going to find the grave sites. And for me, that actually had some really good atmosphere to it. If you weren't aware, Dracula is written at least partially in epistolary form, meaning that it's written through letters, which is again not a favorite narrative form for me. But despite that, it actually, again, worked well. It was an easy book to get through. It doesn't do a lot for feminist literature. I'd say the women in this book are a little bit, I don't know, put to the side, and it's definitely a men have to be men and go out and fight the monster. But I really do think it's a book worth reading. Of course, it's not the original vampire book. There were ones that were written before then, but certainly one that popularized the genre and the creature. And I really did like to see where a lot of these myths and ideas came from, or again, at least got popularized. So if you haven't read it, I say it totally holds up and is definitely worth your time. Now, jumping to something more modern, I want to talk about the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix, which follows a woman who is a housewife and is a mother, and also just not entirely happy with her position in life. And so in her disgruntled state, she ends up forming a true crime book club with some of the other mothers in her suburban neighborhood. And eventually they end up inviting in one man who comes to the neighborhood, and each month they read one of the true crime classics. However, as they get to know this handsome young man who has joined the book club, they start to worry that perhaps he is too good to be true, and they start to worry that he seems to be quite similar to the handsome serial killers that they are reading about in their books. They go on to tell their husbands and try to get the police involved, but because they are just bored housewives, people don't really take them too seriously, and they have to take matters into their own hands. I like this book for several reasons. First off, it's the fact that it does not hide the fact that from the premise, you pretty much know it's a horror book. The guy is probably a vampire, and you're really not supposed to be surprised by that fact. And so knowing that, Grady Hendrix does a really good job of just playing into the tropes of the subgenre and all of the things that vampires do and don't do, and we as a reader enjoy getting to be in on the joke and self-aware. I personally think this is my favorite of all of Grady Hendrix's books, and I just think he hits the nail on the head when it comes to female characters. I really related to the struggle of the main protagonist woman in wanting to be more than a mother and just being a little bit bored in the role of caring for people and making lunches and just again, wanting more of an identity. And I also think that this book does some really interesting things when it comes to the conversation about women not being believed when they come forward, and just their opinions and emotions being dismissed as just being an, again, overly emotional woman. And so I love this book for a lot of reasons. It has some good vampire moments throughout it, and it's just so smart. It's a little bit funny, but it doesn't get over the top so that the humor doesn't erase the scariness or tension. And yeah, I definitely think it's one of his best, and a really good book to read for vampire fans, as well as, again, for people like me, because it's kind of making fun of the genre, and it does some just unexpected and fun things that made it just really enjoyable to read. Next, I want to talk about another favorite, and that is Fledgling by Octavia E. Butler, which follows a young Black girl who wanders out of the woods appearing to have amnesia. However, you find out very early on, not a spoiler, it's on the back, that she is actually not a girl, but actually an older vampire who I believe is in their 50s. And you find out that this person has been genetically modified to have black or dark skin in order to be able to be out during the daylight without being affected by it. This is a piece of science fiction horror, which is a big reason it worked so well for me. So it definitely has those horror elements in the fact that these are vampires, but it also takes it to a different place, and it gives a more scientific explanation for why vampires exist in this world. I don't want to spoil too much, but again, with the genetic engineering, all of that, it's very scientific, and I personally enjoyed it. I know for some people they are put off by this book because of the fact that it is a young girl, or at least in appearance. However, because she is a vampire, it often falls into vampire lore that they tend to be very sexual, and so she does have sexual relations within this book, which again can make readers uncomfortable because they're seeing her or imagining her as this young girl, but really she has the mind and experience of someone much older. It just happens to be her body physically appears younger. So keep that in mind. I totally recognize if that's off-putting to some people. It's not going to be for everyone, but I personally love this book. I love Octavia E. Butler's writing style. It's sparse and just hits the nail on the head. And for me, I found this book absolutely fascinating. And I read this book when I was reading a whole bunch of vampire books back to back for the Books and Freezer podcast. And I think I like this one so much because it was different. It just goes in a different direction. It doesn't play into as many of the tropes as some of the other ones. Like, I don't think there's an issue with garlic or crucifixes or those kind of things that tend to show up in every book. And so I just thought this one was really different. So again, if you are tired of the same old urban fantasy horror books that surround vampirism, I really think that this one might appeal to you. Now, going back to the classics, I also want to talk about I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, which is one of my all-time favorite horror classics, let alone a vampire book. And this follows a man who believes he is the last person alive on Earth at the end of this apocalyptic event that turned everyone into vampires. And so there are these creatures just clawing at the door of his cabin trying to get in, and he is trying to survive. And there's a few reasons I like this book so much. First off, which is probably an unpopular opinion, but I actually prefer zombie fiction over vampire fiction. I read a lot more of it. And so while these are definitely vampires in this book, they actually behave a lot more like zombies. They have more of that mob mentality. They aren't super intelligent. They aren't really sexualized the same way. And so to me, it just felt a little bit reminiscent of that. And so it definitely appealed to my personal preferences. Also, I've said before that I really related to the main character because he is a huge skeptic of the supernatural. So even though these creatures appear to be vampires, they have an aversion to crucifixes and garlic and all of these other signs that basically make them vampires. He knows that that is scientifically impossible, and so he ends up bringing them into his house and conducting experiments and trying to figure out what is actually going on. And I relate to that so much because I've said before, I am a big skeptic, and so I feel like I could have vampires clawing at my door and I could still think, oh, know it's got to be something else. There has to be a reasonable explanation for all this. And so I like how even-minded he is because, yeah, it really hit home. And so again, this one was very unexpected. It's also, of course, a piece of post-apocalyptic fiction, which I've said before, not typically my favorite, but totally worked in this case. This book is grim. It is the end of the world. There isn't a lot of hope in this book. But despite that, it hit me in all the right spots. I really enjoyed it and would recommend it. So if you haven't picked this one up, definitely encourage you to do so. It is so easy to read, very accessible. Again, for people like myself that don't read a lot of classics, this one reads so easily and is definitely worth your time. Next, I want to talk about Vamironica by Greg and Megan Smallwood, and this is the first volume in a Archie comic that I absolutely love. I've talked before about the horror line of Archie comics, and personally, I love them all. This one, of course, follows Veronica, who has possibly been bitten by a vampire and then turns into a vampire herself, as you would expect. And I just enjoyed it so much because, again, it has the Archie feels to it, but it also is a horror book. And I think of all the characters to turn into a vampire, of course it had to be Veronica because she is sexy and suave. And I just really liked it. Again, I think they play a good balance between the sexy and the scary, and she definitely has monstrous features, but she's still Veronica. And I just thought it was so entertaining. So if you're open to graphic novels, especially if you, like me, share a love for the classic Archies of my youth, I definitely recommend checking this one out. It was so much fun. And last, I want to talk about another favorite of mine, and that is Blindside by Peter Watts, which is more of a science fiction story, but it does involve vampires. This is an alien context story, but like nothing you have read before. The aliens in this universe are so different from humans, and this is a story that explores a lot of cerebral or intellectual ideas around personhood and consciousness, and I love it for all these reasons. It is a piece of very hard science fiction, and it definitely will make you think. And of course, because it's included in this video, it involves vampires, which is unexpected and brings in that horror element that I love. Because within this world, humans have been able to genetically bring back vampires that used to exist, and now there are vampires among them today. And again, just like with Fledgling, this book gives scientific explanations behind the vampires, and so this book actually does involve ideas of why vampires are afraid of crucifixes, and it gives a scientific or at least an explanation for that. And so I really like the fact that it plays into the tropes, but then it tries to science it and give you that understanding that definitely appeals to someone like me who is a skeptic. And so I really enjoyed this one. It is creepy. I do need to preface that while this is, of course, primarily a horror video, this book really is intended for people that are already reading science fiction. This is not the most accessible book on this list, and if you're new to sci-fi, I would recommend reading some other books before moving on to this one. Just because, I'll be honest, the first time I read it, some of it went over my head. Like I said, it's really intellectual with some really big ideas behind it, and it's definitely a book that benefits from rereading again. So highly recommend, definitely a different take on vampires and one that I just adore. So that's it for this video. I would love to hear down below which of the books I talked about you are planning on picking up, and of course I would love for you also to recommend me your favorite vampire books, or specifically vampire books that you think I will like based off the ones I picked out here, because again, even some of the really classic horror vampire books like Salem's Lot just missed the mark for me. And so if you know about vampire books that are kind of different, that are maybe a little bit more scientific based, I would love to hear all about them in the comments. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing. I do read a lot of horror, science fiction, fantasy, and thrillers. You can help me out by sharing this video around online, giving it a thumbs up, and if you hit that notification bell, you're never going to miss a video. Thanks for watching. Talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.